Well, our Retina 2C, the shutter is now cooled down, and of course, having cooled down, it is now back to sticking. So I'll remove the shutter from this camera and we'll service the shutter. So again, I'm using my retaining ring tool. There's our shutter. There's our retaining ring. And there were shims on the back of the shutter. They're quite oily. They were stuck to the front of the mount. So I'll pop those to one side. I know that there's some work to be done on the struts, the sliding bellows cover there, but not much else. Let's have a look at this. Well, the first thing I notice is that that rear lens is really dirty, and the dirt's on the inside. So let's take that rear group off and have a look. Yeah, there's dust all over that surface. Quite marked amounts of dust. That's quite unusual. Let's take the front group off. And the same thing, there's a lot of dust there. What would account for that? It's hard to know at this stage. Possibly someone had the camera sitting out on the bench for some extended length of time with the front lens group missing, lifted off, placed down on the bench beside it. Of course, the rear group would be at the back of the shutter. We know the shutter was jammed open. They would both gather up dust from the environment. Let's have a look at this shutter. We know it works when it's warm, and we know it doesn't work when it's cold, which, along with the greasy sort of look of those shutter blades, suggests that it's an oil problem. So I'll start by removing the locking screw here. The little locking screw stops the front retaining ring from unscrewing. I'm pushing this loose. I'm using a toothpick here so that I don't leave scratch marks in there if I slip. If you use the tip of your screwdriver or your tip of your tweezers, if not this time, sometime you will slip and you will leave a nasty scar mark in there, and then you'll wish you hadn't done it. I'll remove the front rings and the shutter speed settings cam plate here. We're into the shutter itself. Remove that little latch. That little latch stops you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter's not cocked. We can depress the shutter release here because the shutter is cocked, but it's not releasing. We'll take out that pinion, take out that curved cocking, internal cocking ring and spring, and this just does not want to move. Unhook the main spring. The main drive spring here for the shutter is very tired. It's exceptionally tired. If you take that tab at being 12 o'clock, this tab here is at about 4 o'clock. Yeah, that's very tired. A good one of these, this tab would be right around at the 2 o'clock position. It would have plenty of tension at the relaxed or almost closed position. This lacks it entirely. And the shutter, of course, will be sticky with oil and dust and filth, so that tired spring would not have enough oomph to close the shutter correctly. So we'll remove a few more things here. I'll just remove the screws from this self-timer. And there's 2 screws for the retard gear train. And my video camera is complaining loudly that its battery is tired and wants to go to bed. So don't be at all surprised if before I have a chance to change the battery, the camera stops. Carrying on. So let's get this latch and flash sync mechanism stuff off here. So the main drive spring's lacking in power is probably caused by this camera having been left with the shutter cocked for an extended period of time, possibly decades. Particularly with an old camera like this, it could have been left in the cocked position for 20 years in between the time someone last used the camera and the present, and in which case, of course, the overstressed spring will relax to its new shape. So I'll just unhook this spring. I'll put something in here to stop that moving while I stretch the spring out and unhook it. If you don't stop this arm from moving, you'll be chasing it, which means you'll have to overstress that spring to try and get it off. Remove the screw here that holds the B lever in position, and this is the return spring for the XM settings lever. Take the B lever off, and the B lever spring. There's one other small spring here on the mechanism plate I want off. It's on this bracket. So I just put a toothpick over the middle of that while I unhooked it so it couldn't get away. You don't want springs zipping off into the distance or whizzing past your ear like that one in the last shutter I did, which I then had to go and hunt out. So 3 case screws at the back here hold the outer case to the inner case, and I'm pleased to see that all 3 are present and correct, because it's not uncommon for one of them at least to be missing, and finding spares is a perennial problem if they're missing. Right, so that case is off. Down to the shutter body here. 3 screws hold our aperture settings lever on the back here. Let's get those off. My main concern with this shutter will be the state of that main spring, and I will probably have to find a better example. That's quite oily. That is very oily. Here, this settings lever here is for our self timer and our flash sync speeds. We're down to the case and the mechanism plate. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and case together. I should be able to lift off the case. The shutter blades came with it because they're stuck there with oil. This is very, very oily. I'll put the mechanism plate to one side with the shutter blades. Yeah, they're very oily. They left a greasy mark on my work mat while I was sliding them across the surface. Okay, so here's the case with the diaphragm blades present. This is very reluctant to move. Those blades are as greasy as. You can add the words to the rest of that. This is a 5-blade diaphragm, so slightly different design than the 10-blade diaphragms we were dealing with, or even indeed with the earlier Retina 3Cs had a 10-blade diaphragm. Okay, so this is their diaphragm blades, and that grease is really thick on those. Here's the retainer plate, the case, and the moving plate. So I'll push those blades to one side. I need to clean these parts, and that has to be done with naphtha and a cotton bud. Let's start with the case. This is a very greasy. And generally speaking, all this will be oils that have come out of the grease from the helical coil, most likely the helical thread of the lens helical. You can see the colour of that. That was just from wiping inside the rear lens mount of the lens tube here at the back, and that is just oil and rubbish. Yes, a lot of oil and dirt on the outside of that case. Right, once more around the inside here, and I think we'll be done with this. Well, that might have been a bit ambitious, perhaps twice around the inside and we'll be done. What I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm removing all of the oil and dirt that's trapped in the crevices here and corners. That will do for the case. We've got the retainer here, the retainer plate. This is very oily. It's useful cleaning components like this by hand because it forces you to look closely at the state of the component, and you may well see faults that otherwise your eye would just gloss over if you weren't forced to look at them so closely. And that's another strike against the idea of flood cleaning shutters as a method of removing all the oils and contaminants. It doesn't particularly work well in any regard because what tends to happen is you just end up shifting contaminants from one spot where they were on an easily available surface to some other place where they're tucked away in crevices where you're never going to find them again. Very often greasy deposits like this will have gathered up dust and other such things, and if you would use a potent solvent to wash away the grease, it wouldn't necessarily wash away the dust and grit and other stuff, and that would remain behind to cause you grief. But by physically removing it, you're taking any dust or grit away. Well, that all looks good. And the blades, let's have a look at these. These are oily, very oily. Alright, diaphragm blades are quite easily damaged, so it's worth taking your time, being quite cautious about cleaning these. Because they have the pivots on them, it's easy to catch those pivots on the cotton bud or the rag or the folded paper or whatever it is you're using to clean them with. And if the blade catches on something, it is easily bent, and if it's bent, it won't lie flat. If it won't lie flat, it's not easy to reassemble the diaphragm. Now this blade shows typical example of blades that have been stuck together with grease or oil for an extended period of time. You can probably see that in the middle at this point it's a bit light coloured, and that's where the surface finish is scuffed through, and it's scuffed through because the oil would have been sucking those blades down hard together, and the edge of the overlapping blades would have just scrubbed right through that plating, being pulled down tight by the grease and oil and grinding into that surface. It's sort of counterintuitive. You think that if there's a layer of oil in there that it would protect the surfaces, but it ain't so. You can see these marks coming off here. Getting the oil from around the pivots is one of the hardest parts, because often the oil, the contaminants sort of flowing under the around the edges of those rivets, and you can never seem to see the back of it. You can see the colour of the grease and containing grit or dust coming off here. I'm holding these down with my tweezers, but I'm being very gentle about it. It's got enough tension on there to stop the thing sliding away from me on the paper and no more. Diaphragm blades are interwoven. There is no first or last blade. Every blade lies on top of the next blade in one direction and under the next blade on the other direction. which makes them fun to assemble compared to shutter blades. Shutter blades typically are just lay out on top of each other in a clockwise or anti-clockwise circle. So there's a first and a last, or a bottom and a top, and sometimes it's important where you start your circle, and in other cases it's not. Some shutters may have a specially shaped shutter blades in one or more positions. The Retina Reflex S comes to mind. Okay, that's good. Well, those parts are clean and I can reassemble that diaphragm. It's much quicker to do a 5-blade diaphragm than a 10-blade diaphragm. So first our retainer plate. Put that on the jig. Where's the jig in here? There it is. And there's a little rivet on here. The rivet is pointing up. I'm taking my blades. Lay these blades in. I'm going around this in an anti-clockwise direction, putting my blades in place. Yeah, those scuff marks are quite prominent on some of these blades. Pull back that blade to expose that hole. Pull back both of those blades to expose the last hole. This is where it's important to have a decent pair of tweezers so that you can pick up blades by their pivot to manoeuvre them into position. Now I'll just swing these blades back into position. All the blades are in position. And the moving plate can go in place. Well, this only goes in one place, and I happen to know that it goes here. And I'll spin this around in a second and you can see the alignment. Why is that one not dropping in? One of my pins is reluctant to fall into place. Why is that? That's better. Okay, that one there's popped out now. Alright. On the retaining plate, the rivet comes up at this point. This rivet here on the moving plate comes up at this point. So if that's at your 6 o'clock position, what's that, at about 4 o'clock? Yeah, the case goes on. That little rivet there that sticks up goes through this hole here, this slightly elongated hole. Wriggle that, make sure it's seated, turn it over, flip my jig up the other way, and there it's ready to go. And there's 3 small screws hold my plate, the retaining plate, in place. As usual, I'll get them all in place, then I'll check that everything works, and then I'll tighten them down. Just in case one of the blades popped out of position while I was putting the case over it. Right, let's take that off there, get that out of the way. Let's Still in the picture, yeah, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see 5 pivot pins correctly in the place there. If I move the moving plate, the adjusting plate, what happens? That's very stiff. That tells me that one or more of those pins is not correctly sitting in position. Let me slacken these screws off very slightly. Give this a wiggle. There you are, dropped into place. That's all good. One of those pins was slightly out of position on the moving plate. If I just tightened those 3 screws up tight, it would have damaged something potentially. There we go, so there's the diaphragm. That moves reasonably smoothly. Looking at these scuff marks here, you can see where those overlapping blades have rubbed at each other. But otherwise that's moving quite smoothly. I'm going to put some graphite powder in there because it doesn't move as freely as I would like. It's not. So with the graphite powder, typically I just gather a little bit up, tip it in here. What I want to do is get to these slots in the moving plate at the back. I'll just tip that around until it's distributed itself around the edge. Just move the action a number of times. Hold it up the other way, do the same. That's all it takes. I'll just go and blow that graphite powder out. That's good. That action's nice and free now, nice and smooth. Now, are there alternatives to doing it that way without graphite powder? Yes, if you've got a soft lead graphite pencil, the moving plate, you can just rub that over both surfaces of that moving plate before you assemble things. That will achieve very much the same sort of result. But the result I'm after is an aperture here, a diaphragm. It opens and closes very easily and very smoothly. Remembering that the setting for this couples to the shutter speed dial at the front of the camera just by spring tension. If there's too much resistance here, the diaphragm won't shift correctly with the shutter speed dial, and you may end up with incorrect exposures because you haven't noticed the aperture hasn't followed the shutter speed dial after you've set the value. So there's our shutter case, the diaphragm in it, screws tightened, that's all moving nicely. I can turn my attention to the mechanism plate, and the mechanism plate is very, very oily. 3 screws hold this together. That one goes through this little bracket that holds the main drive spring. The other 2 screws are almost identical except they're slightly shorter. Perhaps 1/4 millimetre in it, there's not much. Here's the lens tube. Here's our blade actuating ring, and here's our mechanism plate itself. These components need to be cleaned with naphtha to remove any oil, dust and contaminants, and you can see all the oil on the back there that's definitely got to come off. So I'll clean those up, and you've seen that done 1,000 times, so I won't bore you with that part. I've got my mechanism plate all cleaned, reassembled, lubricated that with a bit of graphite powder for good measure, and I can put my shutter blades in position. I've made sure I've got the mechanism plate, the blade actuating ring and the blades open position, and I'll lay these blades in place. Everything was very oily with this shutter, so quite a bit of cleaning was required to get everything to behave itself. Let's have 5 shutter blades in position. I'll lower the outer case on, or the inner case really. Hopefully without disturbing anything. Put the 3 case screws in position. Check that closes and opens correctly. It does. So I can go back, tighten those 3 case screws up. That's good. Right, I'm going to put a touch of molybdenum paste on the detent spring here. And on 2 points on the blade actuating ring, here and here, where the main drive cam connects to it. That's all good. I can start putting a few pieces in here. First I start with the springs. I'm just looking in my container to make sure the springs are present and correct. Excuse me while I change this camera battery. Right, the springs. We zoomed in as far as I want to be. Yes, that further. Having springs in is always entertaining. I'm holding a toothpick over the centre here so that that spring can't get away while I'm lifting the tail of it up. And over the back of that stud there where it's got to connect to. Yeah, it's semi in position. The ends are in place but it's not seated round its boss correctly. No, that's good now. That one was doing its best to get away, but not today. Here's the B lever return spring. That seats in a groove around that shaft there. That's good. If I hold this back, I can open that and put the B lever in position against its return spring here. Need that spring to sit up where I can get behind it easily. It isn't doing it for me. Right, let's get the lever in. That B lever's just not getting a good grip on it with those tweezers. Let's try this one. That's it, a bit of sleight of hand there. I was able to hold that spring up, get the B lever to engage with it all at the same time. This spring, the screw holds the B lever in position. The spring will be the return spring for the flash sync speed lever. Just pull that back around, tucks in against the inside of the case there. Make sure that's doing its job. Make sure the B lever can move. Hold the B lever up, move the blade actuating ring back to close the blades. That's good. That part went smoothly. Some of this flash sync stuff. Here's the pallet wheel. Drop that in amongst the pallets there. And the lever that drives the pallet wheel is here. I just need to put a touch of molybdenum paste on the catch on the end of that where it latches into position. Drop that into place. Hold back that catch and drop this lever down, seat it down correctly. That's good. Now I've got to stretch this spring into position. So I've got to pick this up with my pliers that were here a second ago, and I've done a runner. Excuse me while I find out what I've done with those. How could they get away?